My initial intention was to record this episode during Easter or right after Easter, but I didn't have much time in the past 2 weeks. So we are back and Easter is over already for quite a while. And the end of the dreadful biblical road of suffering is celebrated, but for the European governments, the end of that road is not over yet. And so for this reason, we listen once more to the unofficial anthem of Easter and Jesus Christ's Passion, the Matthäus Passion by Johann Sebastian Bach. Coming to you from the Calvinist North, my name is Jules, and I'm talking once more with political scientist Martín Alberdi, all the way from the Catholic South. Martin, I hope you had a good Easter.
Yes, I did have a good Easter. Thank you very much. I didn't celebrate it. I was in quarantine.
As everyone.
I ate some eggs still.
Yeah. So you also eat eggs back in Spain, just like here?
Yeah, I think we do more or less the same.
What kind of Easter tradition?
I mean, we do the. I don't know if you've heard about the Spanish Semana Santa, where we do some processions on the street, especially in the south of Spain, in Andalusia, and it's basically an event that goes beyond religion. It's a big party. Actually, one of the events that took most to cancel through this COVID crisis was the Semana Santa in Sevilla, because they didn't want to accept reality, so they didn't want to cancel it. But at the end, obviously, it got cancelled.
Oh, wow. So we're both in quarantine still, although I am less than you, Martin. I'm, as I said before, working for a Dutch radio station. So last week I have been every day in Amsterdam. But now I'm safely back home in Maastricht, where everything is still quiet. Although traditional markets did open last week with strict social distancing. How's quarantine life in Madrid and elsewhere in Spain?
Quarantine life is very strict. The feeling is this will go on until the 9th of May, and then they will start loosening restrictions. But it will be then 2 months of this uninterrupted, strict quarantine. So people are fed up, let's say.
We're talking today about the exit strategies that are taking shape all across Europe. So what kind of different exit strategies in the European Union are we actually seeing, Martin?
Well, from what I've been reading, basically the exit strategy is the same for all governments from a theoretical point of view, because the problem they are facing is the same problem, right? The big crucial differentiating element is the constraints in capacity of the governments at hand. So how many masks, how many ICU beds, how many ventilators, how many tests can you do per week? And the second difference would be the enforcement of technology, which is how, or are you even going to track and use technology for identifying the sources of the disease, who is carrying the disease in an asymptomatic and symptomatic way. For this, there are even European ideas on the table. Maybe we can discuss them later. And then the third point is the fact that the government, the type of government differs across European countries. So we have more centralized and decentralized states, and we will see, I think, different exit strategies in terms of how it will apply to subnational regions. So in the case of Spain, what they're discussing is that some regions might, let's say, return to normality earlier than others. So we will see more focused confinement strategies.
I, for instance, cannot imagine that the Netherlands is going to take a decentralized approach. There were some talks about that because the north of the Netherlands is much less infected than the south, which is partly due to the fact that the south is traditionally Catholic. So we did celebrate Carnival, which was a huge source for the coronavirus. The north is Protestant, so doesn't celebrate it. And there were some talks about actually starting the exit strategy in northern Netherlands. But for that, you need, in such a small country, you need to make sure that the north is going to be properly isolated from particularly the west of the Netherlands, where all the big cities are located, like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague. Otherwise, they will all just take the train, and within 3 hours, they can sit on a terrace and drink all evening in a northern city, right? So I think in these small countries, I cannot really imagine that actual decentralized policies will take place. But for those bigger federalized countries like Spain and Germany, and perhaps the United Kingdom, I can completely imagine that, yeah. But so actually you just summed up the 3 categories of differences between the European member states as constraints in capacity, enforcement of technology, and governance levels. Let's stay for a second in the theoretical part of this episode. So get more into the general theory of how such an exit strategy could look like in Europe.
From the theoretical point of view, especially considering more than the technological and the governance dimension, the capacity dimension, we would need, from a theoretical point of view, I think it applies equally to every country, we would need a way to measure, a way to trace, to distance, and support. What do we mean with measuring? With measuring, we mean mass testing. So in order for people to move freely, we have to know what amount of people are infected, how they are infected in an asymptomatic or symptomatic way, and this can only be done by being able to do tests that can check both whether the person has overcome the disease and whether the person has the disease at the moment where he is tested. And this is a capacity constraint which at the moment most of the governments in Europe are still facing.
Yeah, that's the measure part.
If you want to interrupt at any point, feel free.
Yeah. No, I think you're explaining it pretty well. So I think you just properly explained the first step in this strategy, which is measuring, and then the second step would be tracing, right?
Yes, second step will be tracing. It would be maybe nice to emphasize that all these 4 steps, they have to be pursued simultaneously.
Okay, so steps is a bit of a confusing term.
Yeah, maybe steps is indeed, you're right. Maybe it's 4 pillars of the strategy and they have to be followed simultaneously, because otherwise you risk going beyond the peak capacity, hospital capacity, and therefore you have to enforce again a lockdown.
Yeah.
And this might happen on and off in the next months if any of these 4 pillars is not particularly under control.
Yeah, you need to measure, trace, distance, and support simultaneously in order to really face the challenge of this virus.
Yeah, exactly. And so what with tracing, we mean contact tracing. That would be, for example, developing a technology, a mobile phone app, whereby we can identify whether we have been with a person that is infected, and in that case self-isolate before we have symptoms and before we spread the virus. For this purpose, already the European Union is already developing a framework called the Decentralized Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing Framework, which is a very complicated name. And
every time I'm astonished about how unsexy the terms are that are made up in Brussels.
Yeah.
They really never fail to astonish me in giving the most boring terms.
Just reading the name is like a book.
Yeah.
I read a book today and you just say the name. That's already...
Exactly, yeah.
And so the goal of this framework, as I said, is to determine the likelihood of infection via the physical proximity you have to an infected person. There are, however, major challenges to the development of this framework, because you have to ensure that it provides security and privacy protections, so that it's anonymous and that it prevents abuse of data. So it also minimizes the amount of information, and this has to be incorporated in the design of the framework. This is called, like, in the technology sphere, they call it privacy by design, not trust. So instead of saying we trust the government to use the data as they feel fit to do, we develop a framework which does not depend on the trust we give to the government, but is basically anonymous by design.
Right. And I think within the European Union, it is very unlikely that such an app will not be installed on a voluntary base. For instance,
What, yeah, what do you think about that? Because I mean, once you develop the technology, people have to voluntarily be open to download it and use it, right? Maybe it creates some additional inefficiencies, so it might take a long time
yeah,
until this
you
happens.
could, you would think so. But so first of all, you have a rather similar app in South Korea, and this was presented in the United States as an app that could likely be adopted, albeit by integrating it in a more pro-American way, so to say, to make it in a way that it would be accepted in American culture. And one of the demands in that context would be that Americans would only get the app if they voluntarily installed it, so it would not be obligated, in opposite to some Asian countries. And the researchers argued that it's very likely that a big part and a sufficient part of the population would install it, because otherwise, if you don't have the app, you cannot find out if other people around you are infected. So you may not be interested in sharing your information, but you still want to have the information of the people around you. And on that note, Czechia installed one of the first of these apps in Europe just about a week ago. They started to apply it in Prague. And apparently the number of people who are willing to install it has been astonishing, especially in a country with very low political participation. One may expect actually that people are not very obedient to governmental ideas, but quite the opposite has been proven to work in Czechia. But then on the other hand, you're right now seeing in the Netherlands that a lot of these apps are being produced and none of them are really adapted yet in society. So it seems also that it's very different per country. And I also feel like it very much also depends on the campaign of such an app. So I know that in Czechia, they campaigned it really thoroughly.
Don't you think that also in the Netherlands, there will be a tipping point where people will realize that they either give away some of their privacy or they will have to face some restrictions in the freedom of movement? So for Spaniards, at least from my, let's say, individual point of view, I am willing to give out my data for me to be able to move around freely again.
Yeah, I would also. And I think, I don't think this is any different in the Netherlands, honestly. We said enough about measuring and tracing. So then the third pillar of the exit strategy would be distancing, which is basically restricted isolation, right?
Distancing is exactly restricted isolation. So it's how do you, once you identify the person who holds the virus, how do you, on the one hand, how do you reincorporate him in society? And there are being discussions about distributing certificates of immunity. So once you have passed the virus and you have antibodies, you're able to return to society because you're not able to get infected or infect others. And so you are an economic asset and you should go back to producing whatever you produce or do a normal life, let's say. This is a bit controversial as well because it can create some inequality, right? Let's say the healthiest people in society are the ones who are treated as first-class citizens, let's say. This might be a bit dystopian, but it's under discussion in Italy and in Germany, as far as I know. So this is on the one hand. On the other hand, how do you isolate individual people instead of the masses of people or countries? So the more the technology will be developed, the more specific and tailored will be the isolation. And as far as I've read on Sweden, they haven't had, let's say, a proper lockdown. It's the exception in Europe, But what they're doing now, or they're developing now, is basically they are developing a policy to prohibit the risk population of leaving their houses and letting the rest of society return to normal life. So risk population is mostly the elderly or people who have any previous condition, and therefore they are more exposed to the severity of the virus. Do you have any discussion in Northern Europe, where you sit, about this certificate of immunity?
It very much again differs between the member states. First of all, the Netherlands is one of the countries where the least people are tested. And this is not really a political strategy. This is not a political choice, political decision. But this is simply because one of the testing laboratory and companies in the Netherlands owns a majority of the laboratories in the Netherlands. And it has turned out not to be a very efficient company who has not really prepared for any situation like this. And that is definitely a political miscalculation in the Netherlands. Now this company is being pushed out of the market pretty aggressively by the government. But it's of course too late. You can ask questions about isolation certificates or immunity certificates, but if no one is being tested, then that's really not gonna work. Yeah. So I can imagine that in Germany this really would work on the long term because so many people are being tested in Germany. I don't know how's the situation in Southern Europe.
Well, this is something I really need a European perspective to because there is a lot of self-loathing in Spain with the government and the management of the crisis here. And I'm just wondering whether this is a product of, let's say, a very self-centered analysis, in the sense that people in Spain, they don't look beyond Spain, so they see the amount of cases, they see the failure of the equipment they buy, that the tests that come from China are they're not well designed, that we have no masks, that the elderly have not been properly isolated, and people don't have a point of comparison. And my personal opinion is that in cross-European perspective, there have been also a lot of problems in buying equipment, right? You're saying the Netherlands, for example, the biggest producer of tests turns out to be completely unreliable.
Oh, not only that, the Netherlands is one of the countries with the biggest lack of masks. So it's the sole reason why the government has not obligated the wearing of masks in certain situations, whereas Belgium did, Austria did, Germany did in specific situations. The Netherlands didn't. For a very long time, the Dutch government said that this is not necessary. And, they gave some arguments that actually make sense. For instance, you have to properly use it in order to make it work. You should keep them there for the people who really need it, etc., etc. But only at some point, I believe it was about last week, the Dutch government started to use a new argument, which turned out to be the most important argument, namely, we don't have them. So there's a lot of incredibly wrong political miscalculations in the Netherlands, and they all really boil down to one thing and one thing only, and that is that Germany just have taken into consideration the possibility of a future pandemic, and the Netherlands really hasn't that much. That's the difference in the end, and now you can see the difference between the countries very clearly.
Yeah. And how is the public responding to the management of the crisis? Because in Spain, there is, maybe it's, apparently it's one of the exceptions in Europe, but polarization is increasing, and there is really lots, the political atmosphere is super emotionally charged.
I mean, this is really crazy, I think, and we talked about it already last episode, right? How come that the Spanish government is becoming less and less popular, whereas most governments in Europe are enjoying a rise in popularity. And I still feel like we didn't give a very clear answer to that. Sure, and I mean, you're also indicating it right now. Sure, the situation in Spain is worse than in most other countries in Europe, especially in terms of capacity, in terms of death numbers, in terms of infected numbers. But so is Italy. And look at the Conte government. The Conte government is actually seeing a rise of popularity. We're coming to the fourth and last pillar of the exit strategy theory.
Yeah.
Social policies.
Yes. This social policies, which is the supporting, this is the more economically oriented pillar of the strategy, which has to do with how do you support in terms of wage setting and also health policy the population while the whole recovery process is still ongoing. And here you have obviously the equipment questions. So do people have to wear masks on the street? That's an banal example. And this has to do also with whether you have you have equipment for people to wear it. And more in terms of economics, you in Spain, for example, they're implementing now a basic income, and it's going to start around 500 euros. So this is a response to the crisis from an economic point of view. I think the key question is whether this is going to be a temporary basic income or a permanent one, because we see also in other countries, in Canada, for example, they are giving out directly money to the citizens through an online application in a matter of days. And so maybe the shift is taking different forms worldwide, but the direction is towards giving money to people unconditionally.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay. So that's definitely something interesting we can talk about another time again. So let's go back to the other question that you had, whether I have like optimism on the EU's future exit strategies in terms of overcoming the closed borders right now, right? So one of the goals could be of the European Union to bring back the freedom of movement, which is so central to the European Union's legal framework. And right now this freedom is not there. The borders are closed. And I really think it's a good question, but I would like to take the perspective of public opinion and political legitimacy to underline how important the European freedom of movement is, or actually rather how unimportant it actually may be. And the question would be, in that regard, is the European Union losing legitimacy because the European internal borders are closed? I think we would have reason to be optimistic about the European Union if in the end Europeans are not going to lose their trust in the Union. And if Brussels proves to be in any form useful in this pandemic, I think the European Union would be doing a good job and would be gaining a lot of support among people. If they remain mainly invisible, as they are actually today, I think there is less reason to be optimistic. And that's really, in my view, the challenge that Europe is facing. It's not about whether the borders are going to open soon or not. My gut feeling and my experience in talking with people around me is that people are pretty okay with any decision, really. Whether it's closing the borders, whether it's opening the borders, as long as the decision is understood as a way to overcome this crisis. So closing the borders or not, I don't know if that'll change the mood in the European Union for better or worse. And I think in the end, you and I are often talking about political challenges within Europe. And I think you would agree with me if I say that most political challenges and most political crises are called crises because they depend on political legitimacy. The European migrant crisis was a legitimacy crisis, and the Euro crisis...
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, this goes, from my point of view, to the core of the structural deficiencies of the European Union. This is something that I in my previous internship I was dealing with, which was the internal conflict between the political legitimacy of the parliament, the European Parliament, and the executive power of the states. So in the case of Europe, the problem, the communication problem you have that you were highlighting is that you have a parliament that is voted on a national basis. So you have, let's say, Spanish political parties represented in European political parties in the European Parliament, but these Spanish politicians are not voted in the Netherlands nor in Germany, so they're not European, let's say. And on the other hand, at the end of the day,
and wait,
you have
and
that the power resides in the head of states in the European Council. So the last word is always national, and this creates a communication problem. It is a logical problem because basically the countries, they have to respond to their national constituents. So Pedro Sanchez cares about Spanish voters, not about European voters, because there is not such a thing as a European voters. And therefore, this is a problem that goes well beyond the actual situation, but which this situation accentuates, as we saw when countries at the beginning of the crisis decided to close the borders unilaterally and in a completely uncoordinated way. And you see again how the single market, which we always defend, when there is a crisis, the single market breaks down.
Yeah, but I don't know. I don't know if it really breaks down in a pandemic. I mean, China has isolated some of its provinces, and Russia has isolated some of its oblasts, and some US states are thinking of isolating themselves from one another. Is this decision in the US an attack against the common American market? You're pointing out some rightful worries, but at the same time, I don't think we can compare the isolations within the European common market right now with a normal situation.
I mean, I completely understand that countries, that they close, that they withdraw in a moment of crisis, such as a pandemic, where the freedom of movement is one of the causes of the explosion of the epidemic. What I feel is wrong is that there is not coordination in this closure. So, for example, if there is, let's say, a movement from within the single market from Spain to Germany, but not from Germany to France, which is, I'm just making it up, then you basically do not know how the virus is spreading and how it is moving from one border to another, and there is no real, not real centralized communication, which might be crucial to have the virus under control. So the bottom line basically is that unless there is a coordinated, centralized response to how people are moving within the single market, we won't be able to reopen it. It's as simple as that. And I mean, you see it also in the fact that on a per capita basis, Europe is the place worldwide with more infections and more deaths. If you compare, let's say, the outbreak in the US, which is huge, with Europe, not Spain, France, UK, blah, blah.
If you believe the data of China, of course, right?
If you believe the data of China, yeah, given that you believe China. But you see that the outbreak in Europe is colossal. It's huge.
Yeah.
And partially it's because
definitely.
there is no coordination, I believe.
Maybe part of it. I mean, I think the biggest reasons are still overpopulation, over-urbanization, and a very aging population. I mean, all of these three conditions are there within the European
that's a
Union,
different
right?
take, a very cool point, actually.
But yeah, I tend to be, I wanted to say that I tend to be more optimistic in this situation, but I don't think optimism is necessarily the good word. I do think, and I completely agree with you on that, I do think that the European Union has to become visible, much more visible in this crisis, because people expect such a big political entity to do at least something, to at least try to do something together. And that's not happening right now. But in defense of Europe right now, I think the best way of limiting such a virus is partly through technological cooperation, but also partly through local isolation. I think you can see that in every big country, that big countries where there is a lot of centralized cooperation going on, there too, regions are isolating themselves from one another, and regions are taking different policies from one another because regions differ so much. And in that sense, it's on the one hand true that we're facing a common challenge, which is this virus, obviously, but it's also true that a virus is particularly vulnerable, particularly adaptive to the given environment, right? So it behaves very differently in different environments, and the environments are really different within Europe. But, I mean, maybe this is just my attempt to give a counter argument. I think it does sound now as if I disagree with your emphasis on the need of further cooperation. I completely agree with this, and I think it is also like we shouldn't really stick to the old topic that we talked about in the last episode, but I do think that the debate about Corona bonds and Euro bonds is a good example of how the European Union is not able to come closer together, even though they're in this common challenge right now, right? You were actually just emphasizing that in the end, this is really the same old internal conflict in the EU between the political legitimacy of its European Parliament and the executive power of the heads of states. So you were talking also about how even there is this division within the European Parliament. But I was quite surprised that 1 week ago the European Parliament was voting on special pan-European measurements in the fight against the coronavirus, and was a whole package of legal guidelines that European member states were supposed to follow. And it was passed in the European Parliament, and every single member of the European Parliament voted in favor. Even the Eurosceptics, even the far right, even the far left, everyone really did, except for one single member. So there's this guy who voted against these special measurements, and his name is Ivan David. He's a Czech member of the European Parliament, and he's part of the European Conservatives and Reformists, or the ECR. And the ECR, as you may know, is known for being a party that is right in between the European skeptic far right and the moderately pro-European center. It's a very awkward alliance between these two groups, really. And so I really wanted to know why you voted against. And honestly, I have still no idea. I sent him an email. He did reply with an automatic message. Feels like it was automatic, at least. I'm not sure if it was.
We can encourage our listeners to text this guy via Twitter, email, homepage.
Please
find
do
out
so.
who is this guy. Why did he vote
just
against?
Google, take a look which of your national parties belongs to the European Conservatives and Reformists, because it is my honest opinion that this is by far the weirdest party alliance in the European Union, and I feel like Ivan David is a good embodiment of this party.
Europe again has a big play to roll. It has a big role to play, not a big role to a big play to roll. And in the next days, we will find out what is the economic response. And I think in a longer time horizon, maybe in the next month or in the next month and a half, we will find out how we regain the single market as we know it, either by cooperation or in coordination, or by any other mechanism which is yet unknown. This would be my... And then we learned about Ivan David, which is not trivial.
No, not at all. Well, I think the most important thing is that we will continue to follow the European Union in its road of suffering, its road of crises and successes and failures, and we will definitely also follow the road of Ivan David.
Long live Ivan David.
Yes, definitely.